Remothered is a third-person indie horror adventure game released in January of 2018. The mysterious protagonist finds herself trapped in a Victorian-style mansion on a stormy night. Stalked by the deranged homeowner, you'll solve puzzles, hide in closets, and try to understand the ever-twisting story. Remothered wears its inspiration on its sleeve. Being a fan of the Clocktower series and Italian schlock horror movies, I fell in love with this game really early on in my first playthrough. In light of a recent sequel announcement, Going Porcelain, I wanted to share why I feel this game is worth a look, especially if you're a horror fan like me. The horror genre is oversaturated these days. Type horror into the Steam search bar and scroll down to see what I mean. Due to the nature of no big AAA horror releases coming out these days, it means that the horror genre is an indie dev's playing field. There's some really great little titles out there, and there's also some really bad ones. A lot of these games try and sell you on an experience, for better or worse. Popularized by Amnesia, a lot of indie horror games today follow the run-and-hide gameplay loop while you push a button or solve a puzzle to shove you into the next segment. Remothered is a really nice blend between classic survival horror elements and new horror trends. Running and hiding is certainly an important aspect in the gameplay, but the puzzles and riddles to solve remind me more of an old point-and-click game with its occasional backbending logic. Puzzles like this actually incentivize the player to explore where you might find, say, a battery to get a small lift working, instead of just aimlessly wandering around looking where to rub your X button next. Because of this, the exploration is just a treat, as you creep around in the open yet labyrinthine manner, discovering bits of lore and hints where to go next. Level design in Remothered is just superb. The mansion is built in this almost circular way, with 2 entrances and exits in most rooms and areas with the occasional dead end. By halfway through the game, I had a complete mental map of the mansion, carefully planning what room I wanted to explore next and where I would run if I encountered the stalker. Though, running and hiding isn't your only option. Scattered around the environment are items you can throw to distract or hurt your stalker, depending on what you're throwing or who you're throwing it at. Sometimes it'll get them to leave you alone, and sometimes it'll be ineffective. Oftentimes, it almost feels necessary to bait the stalker onto a specific floor or distract them elsewhere so you can run and solve a puzzle or perform a lengthy action, one of those dead ends I mentioned earlier. This is really great game design. The player has multiple ways to solve a problem without one of them being a guarantee or the best option. It's unpredictable, yet thoughtful. It encourages the player to be careful and strategic. No horror game is complete without a story though, and Remothered certainly delivers something. To be blunt, the story is hard to follow, but that doesn't mean it isn't good or enjoyable in some sense. At first, motivations can be murky or questionable at best. Cutscenes are quick and characters talk fast. The story can really slip away from you if you're not careful. The game is well paced though. A slow burn opening shifts to something that's a little more suspenseful and atmospheric pretty naturally. I won't spoil anything plot related here, but the narrative itself has more twists than a pretzel. Overall, the story, the atmosphere, and the character design feel like one big homage to Italian giallo movies. These are dark horror or thriller films that usually involve a crime committed by a slasher that's investigated by someone who usually isn't a police officer. All of this adds up though. Even Clocktower was inspired by Dario Argento films. It only makes sense developers trying to recapture the feeling of an older game would refer to its inspiration instead of the game itself. Otherwise, the game can end up feeling like a copy of a copy instead of something truly inspired. I really enjoyed and can appreciate this aspect. The giallo is an influence we don't generally see in a lot of video games these days, done well at least, and the developers seem to have nailed it this time. By the end of the game, I understood what happened in terms of the narrative and why it had happened. Though it was muddled at some points along the way, it had a nice little conclusion, and I'm very interested to see how the sequel fleshes it all out. All in all, I find it ever more difficult to choose an indie horror game out of an online storefront and get an actual game, rather than a spooky walking simulator. Remothered is not a game that sacrifices its gameplay for scares, or vice versa. While the main character is mostly helpless against the enemies, there is still plenty to do and interact with. Remothered's gameplay is a lot more clever than what you'd expect out of a game like this. It seamlessly blends modern game design with retro game theory. I'm really looking forward to what Stormind Games and Chris Darrell have for the sequel. While this game is a breath of fresh, terror-filled air, there's certainly room for improvement. Remothered is a game that reminds us of those stormy nights in front of the CRT, with the quality of life features and playability of something a little more modern.